Wake up!
And ladies and gentlemen, if you're standing by.
Hello, adventurers, pilgrims, myth makers, and cosmonauts. If you have found this space station, you must be interested in history, herstory, mystery, and bees. Thank you for showing up, suiting up, and traveling with us as we explore the world of bees, from the time they arrived on a shooting star to a 2021 journey they took into outer space. I'm Laura Bee, and my fellow cosmonaut and explorer is Andrew Gough. And today we're going to talk about Kybele and her connection to an ancient meteorite. Here we go.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to Bees in Space. This is episode 3, where we're going to be talking about Kybele, Kybele, and her connection to the meteorite. And my name is Laura Bee.
And I'm Andrew Gough.
And we're really excited to have you here. So let's start out with a little Bees in Space. Andrew, you had a really cool video.
Let me launch the infamous slide deck, and we can just kind of dive into it. And excuse me while I share my screen. Bees in Space, Cubes and Curiosities. So, kind of building upon the origins of the goddess that we spoke about in episode 2 and Catal Huyuk, and how the images of the goddess were revered in ancient times. And starting to hint a little bit, not a lot, but a little bit at why bees in space and what does space have to do with bees. And no better way to kind of dive into that, I think, than to examine a recent news article about a comet that we were able to land on and record the sound of for the very first time. So imagine knowing what a comet sounds like. Can we even imagine? Let's have a listen.
Yeah.
Now, you're a beekeeper. I am not. Does that resonate at all with you as a hive-like sound?
Honestly, if you listened to the bees through the wood, that would sound like a bee moving around and talking.
High pitch now.
If you slowed, the pitch, it'd be interesting to slow down the pitch or speed up the pitch or something.
Yeah.
That sounds like a bird.
We know the sound of a bee as it does its waggle dance, as it goes and retrieves the food. Do we know what the sound of the wings are?
Oh, wow. I don't know. So what's interesting is that since it's going through space, there's no air. So it's not meeting any friction. There's no friction in space.
There's a certain rhythm to it of high pitched, and that's just amazing. That's just an amazing sort of
I'm gonna sit with it. But the idea of sound is essential to the story of bees and space, and also the bee goddesses that we're going to talk about today. Kybele in particular, she's a goddess that has drums with her, so she's also associated with sound. So that's good to start thinking about the sounds of space as we're learning about this goddess, this connection, and so forth. I love it.
And there's so much serendipity in symbology and imagery. So this comet that we landed on and recorded the sound of, they call it Rosetta. So you think, okay, so what? It's called Rosetta. But I think of the Rosetta Stone. Now, the Rosetta Stone comes from the Egyptian Delta in a place called Rosetta. However, before it was in Rosetta, they moved it from Sais.
No. Yes.
So now we have the only place on the planet where the legend of Atlantis comes from, where Neith is buried in the goddess. Neith is buried in the house of the bee, and Osiris is buried in the mansion of the bee. And that's where the Rosetta Stone comes from.
Well, what was the house of the bee? The house of the bee was the first university of Egypt. And it was a medicine college, and it dealt a lot with reproductive things as we were learning about animal husbandry and birthrights and lineages and the influence of the masculine on reproduction and the emergence of patriarchy. It's like, that's when we started to really, back then in the Sais time, it was called the House of the Bee, and it was a place of letters, of learning, of ideas.
And it's one of those serendipitous things. I'm sure the person who named this comet Rosetta, it's a lovely name, but it's completely unintentional in terms of its association with bees, because it's kind of an obscure fact, but it's fascinating how that plays out, isn't it?
It is an association, though, with the Rosetta Stone, which is language. It's 3 different languages: linear A, linear B, and whatever else. What is the other one?
And there's a little Greek, and there's a little B on, of course, the hieroglyphic in the Rosetta Stone. You can go up in the British Library where they have the real one, but they have the imitation one, and you can touch it and look at it, and it's just really fun to examine.
I want to see that. So maybe it's again one of those serendipitous things that, because of the qualities of these ancient bee cultures, the symbols are still being used in contemporary times. And then we discover in the myths and in the goddess archetypes sound references, and for the first time are able to hear a sound. Well, maybe back in those days, people could hear this in some way with our massive brains and interest in the stars. I mean, that's when they named the stars back then. That's when they were saying, oh, this is the Leo constellation, this is the Taurus constellation, this is the whatever this is,
Absolutely.
The planets had names of gods. So did they hear something from them in some kind of meditation? Because there wasn't any, terrestrial influence other than nature.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And it's a perfect segue into bees in space. And well, why are we even talking about bees in space? I love this notion that the Greeks referred to bee souls, and bestowed the title of Melissa on unborn souls. I mean, that's heading us in that direction quite quickly. And then we have this 3rd century philosopher who is saying that souls arrived on Earth in the form of bees, having descended from the moon goddess Artemis. So, I mean, there's so much information in that one sentence. Bees from space, moon goddess Artemis.
Well, there's your space right there.
There's your space right there.
Yeah.
And they were lured to Earth because of the earthly delights, such as honey, the terrestrial sort of nirvana that they didn't have in space. And I think, you've mentioned to me before just how ironic that is, because the entities that create these wonderful substances are now seeking them.
Or conversely, that by the time this 3rd century guy comes along, this is a vestigial story of a greater myth that really flips it, just like the snake, in the Garden of Eden is really this ancient divine feminine wisdom. So too, the bees, who having come from the space, the moon goddess, from her body, probably most myths talk about it being of the body of gods. They're not created on earth. There's very few mythologies that say, oh, the God created out of mud, the people, the bear, the dogs, and bees. No, they never talk about the bees. The bees come from the tears of Ra. They come from the body of the goddess. They come from outer space.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
this is saying the promise of, no, rather they promised us these delights.
We've spoken in the past, and we'll speak again about the fact that history is what it is, but it's not fact, it's not reality. It's been told in the way that the victors wanted the story to be told. So, you mentioned the snake in the Garden of Eden, and Adam and Eve are expelled from the Garden of Eden because they've eaten the apple, and et cetera, et cetera. And I love the fact that in a recent, like a kindergarten class, some young boy raised his hand and said, well, Adam and Eve were expelled from the Garden of Eden and they went to the land of Nod. Who was Nod?
Who was Nod?
Who was Nod? It's a great question. Oops, skipped over that bit in the history book.
Uh-huh.
So there's so much that hasn't been told, and so much has been told that it's just been made up.
Right.
And that's what we want to focus on, really, is what are our hearts and what does our intuition tell us, without going crazy and ridiculous and extrapolating madness. What is a more sensible interpretation of symbology or ancient writings or whatever the case may be?
I love that we have the opportunity to look at thousands of images at a fingertip, because the people that wrote down this quote unquote history, they were only operating from reading, the Bible and going to universities in the 1800s or whatever. And so, they're still figuring out how to do mass publications. So books aren't even, they're more difficult to get. And I remember going to college and standing next to my pile of books, which came up to my eyebrow, and that I had to buy, and have to read all those books and go to the library and get the cards and write the numbers and find it on the shelf. Like, this is a whole different era now. So when you and I get to look at these symbols, we get to reference them and are able to make connections that maybe couldn't have been done before, even though that information is called fact. It isn't fact. It's fact based on a certain set of peer review.
That's such a great point. And not only is it such a privilege, it's an obligation to use the mind for that purpose, because nobody else before our generation had the opportunity to do that like we can.
Right.
So, we spoke in episode 2 about Catal Huyuk and Kybele and the origins of the goddess, but really Kubaba, just you say that word Kubaba, and it almost it vibrates when you say it. And this is the queen of Sumer, who appears to have inspired the cult of Kybele. She's the only queen on the Sumerian kings list, the only queen, reigned for 100 years. And I think, that's just sort of a way of saying a really long time. She was amazing. But this is a long time ago, right? 4,500 years ago. And we have this imagery, once again, of the goddess with a poppy. So there's that sign of the otherworldly opium, heroin, psychedelic experience. But what is in her other hand? A drum, a mirror, a symbol? Why can't archaeology tell us what that is?
Well, maybe it's we were talking before about how do they represent sound.
That's right.
A lot of these ancient cultures reference sound in terms of origin and, mother. And even some say that the word mother, or mama, it's the first word of anybody's mouth, of anybody's language. Like, usually that's the first thing you say is mama, and sometimes dada, but there you go. So that's like just this, how do we express sound in imagery? And maybe that's a rattle, because also trance and medicine, like using an entheogenic plant like poppy with sound, can create a holy state for an individual. A rattle, on a entheogenic journey.
Absolutely. And this image has a bit of motion to it. If you just use your imagination a little bit, it's kind of like a little dance going on there. And she's the mountain mother of Anatolia. So that is clearly a precursor for Kybele. Stroke Artemis, stroke Diana and Ishtar. I mean, this is where that tradition comes from, certainly not where it ends. And, so who is Kybele? She's all these things. She's the great mother. She's the mother of all gods and humans, the mother of Neolithic Catal Huyuk that we spoke about in episode 2. She's all these things. And, I think for me, what jumps off the page is that she, in her most famous incarnation, is a meteorite, a black stone that has fallen to Earth. You couldn't make it up. I mean, it's just such perfect symbolism for what we know about the goddess. And it's a thread that is so apparent to anyone who just takes the time to look. The meteorite, the black stone, the goddess. It's a uniformity of symbolism that just resonates, don't you think?
Absolutely. I while you were speaking about it, I was like, oh, there's one pearl and another pearl, and it makes the same necklace. It's like graduated pearls on a necklace, or nesting dolls, Russian nesting dolls,
Yeah, and we'll talk probably ad nauseum about the fact that she's got a lion or 2 lions, typically 2 lions accompanying her. Lions were spiritual and revered in the Bronze Age, but they're also celestial. It's Leo. It's got other connotations, and we haven't wrestled that one to the ground yet. I mean, that's what the lions represent is open for debate. But what I think we can say with some certainty is that we're looking at the most revered goddess that ever has been. And I think the fact that she's not more readily acknowledged as being that is because we forget how she was manifested through time. And when we rediscover that, it's like, oh my goodness, it's so obvious.
Well, we could also and will make the case that not only is this goddess alive and well, she is still being worshipped. And we're going to get to that in episode 8. But I can also say that there may even be a reference still to this goddess to Mary, the mother of Jesus. And so in the Christian faith, or more Catholic end of the Christianity, is still being revered. And in a lot of places that had strong indigenous recent indigenous main cultures like the Americas, and possibly just indigenous places and other lands as well, like Africa, you'll see Mary more venerated than Jesus, because it's still so close to what is the true or is the Neolithic or first understanding of what God is, and being connected to that element of it. So I think it's still being, I would make the case that she is still alive and still being, we just have lost the connection because they buried Mary, because they turned her into a mortal goddess and buried her. But they buried her where? Near Ephesus, where Artemis lived.
And has she been reborn? Was that the last incarnation in, what's the better phrase, sort of religious or spiritual realms? Was Mary the last, or has there been another?
I don't think there's been another newborn goddess, but I think anthropologically, that's why girls are obsessed with princesses, is because we are seeking. So, the closest thing we have is like Beyonce, Kim Kardashian, Greta Thunberg. These are the goddesses on earth today. If we're going to archetype it as a person, I mean, I don't see any other archetype for girls or women other than potentially literally.
Interesting. Yeah, that's
Because
sad, but very interesting.
in order to be a politician or a spiritual leader, you have to adopt masculine roles, masculine duties, masculine hierarchy. So there isn't, other than Greta Thunberg, I can't see another archetype that has existed on the planet. Maybe Mother Teresa, but even then, feet of clay, so there's a whole story behind that. So
yeah, don't want to go there.
isn't there, is there any? No, I would say there is none, except, and I'll do this, we can't get into it. Boy, this could be a whole nother thing. I would love to do references of bees in modern culture on an archetypal level. And I would do that.
Well, there's lots of those, right? There's lots of those.
Yeah,
you have Lana Del Rey with the beehive hairdo. You've got the Supremes, the beehive hairdo.
You have Paula White calling down Devorah the Mother Bee on Mother's Day as an evangelical Christian and support for the former president. So anyway, we're getting off track, but this is a good one. Okay,
yeah,
going.
Yeah. All right.
One thing I wanted to say, go back real quick. One of the things I wanted to say about the word cult is I think it's used in a modern era to represent dangerous side groups that might take you down. And I think what, as in our world, cult means the center of a culture. So the religious eye of a culture. So I love, whenever I say that, did the Greeks in Asia Minor spread her culture to the mainland? Yes, they did. They spread her culture to the mainland, and at the center was the cult. The eye of the culture was this veneration for this Magna Mater. So I just wanted to mention that for people.
Yeah, it does have bad connotations for people who don't really understand this historical relevance of it, like you say. So that's a good point. And yeah, many different names, right? So Google any dictionary, Kybele, you're going to get a whole raft of names. It's because she has many different manifestations in many different cultures, which is why they give her a slightly different name, but it all comes back to the same qualities. And the Anatolian mother goddess, well, who's in Anatolia? The Hittites. And they're a strong beekeeping nation. And the word Melissa comes from the Hittite word meaning Melita, which means honey. And there you can see these fantastic images. And I probably always seen things, but when I see that kind of headdress, I can't help but think that, could it be, is it inspired by a beehive sort of plume design? But in Hattusa, the Anatolian capital of the Hittites, there's like 108 different temples. So for all the different regions that they conquered, they didn't make them worship their gods. They said, your gods are welcome in our capital and we'll give you a temple. And this is a temple where this green cube stone is. And nobody, no archaeologist, no scholar, no historian can tell you what it was used for or where it came from. The best guess is that it was a gift from an Egyptian pharaoh, but it stands out like a sore thumb in a city where the Hittites presided over their capital and they were bee worshiping people. So it just makes you wonder what that could have been used for.
Maybe it's a pedestal, an altar stone, for like we see later in your trip to Pessinus, or is that where you were going when you saw that?
Yeah, I mean, just the cube shape. I mean, it seems, doesn't it seem it's been artificially shaped? Look at the side of it. It's almost square, but then it's rounded. Doesn't look like a natural shape. Could be, but it's got some precision to it. And nothing really in the immediate vicinity. Of course, it could have been moved over the centuries. It's just a very curious thing to have and gets the mind thinking about the cube shape and people who venerated the bee.
Yeah.
So Kybele, Anatolia, she has an equivalent, of course, the Cretan equivalent of Rhea, and all the same qualities apply. The great thing is that Rhea gives birth to Zeus in a cave on Crete, but she's able to give birth to him and save his life because her husband is eating all the babies. And she's like, you can't eat all the babies. So she feeds him a stone, cube-shaped stone, and saves Zeus in the process. And that is just such a powerful, in and of itself. Is it a big deal? No, but it's part of this tradition now of bees and stones, and more often than not, black stones and meteorites.
Mm-hmm.
And so Rhea on Crete, you have Mount Ida, and Mount Ida and nearby Mount Ida are two different caves that claim to be where Zeus was brought up and fed honey by nymphs. They're both, amazing places and really enigmatic and atmospheric. So here we have Mount Ida on Crete, but we also have Mount Ida in Turkey, in modern day Turkey, in Anatolia. And we know from the DNA analysis that it's the people from Crete who come here and name this mountain after their sacred Mount Ida. I just think that's so special because this is where the Sibylline books are written by bee goddess Sibyls, and they travel all around Anatolia and they go to Italy and they end up in Rome. And when they end up in Rome, so this is where they're written here in Mount Ida in Turkey. But when they end up in Rome, they're used, ironically, to communicate with spirit, to understand what do we do now? We're losing the war to Hannibal. Meteorites, ironically, are falling from the sky. We have to consult the books. And the books say, no, you can't give a day of reverence to a god or goddess. That's not good enough. You need her. You need the one and only Kybele. Go get her. She's a meteorite and she's in Turkey. So it's just such a serendipitous story. And of course, that's a big ask to go and get Kybele. So you want to make sure that that is what the gods and goddesses really want you to do. So they stop in Delphi on the way and they consult the Delphic bee. And she would have been consuming hallucinogenic honey and other perhaps heroin and poppy products, opium, and just being able to commune with spirit to give confirmation that yes, it is the right thing to do to go get Kybele. And you can't ignore the fact that the mythology says the second temple at Delphi, which is the one that we're talking about, they're being visited by the Roman legion on their way to Turkey, was built by bees. And the oracle stone is shaped, I feel, like a beehive, a crisscrossing rows of bees. And in ancient times, bees weren't always depicted as bees. They were kind of like stick images sometimes, and double axes even, and just different kinds of symbolism that we can't really appreciate. Also, in Greece, the priests at Delphi were called the Labrides. Now, Labrys is the word where labyrinth comes from. It's a Cretan word. And in Crete, the symbol of the bee was a double axe. And when we do an episode and go deep into Crete, the viewers will see these amazing double axes that are really bees. Mm-hmm. So the serendipity is really high. It looks a lot like a beehive, crisscrossing rows of bees, and there is a hole. It's an actual functioning, I believe, could have been an actual functioning beehive.
So the interesting thing about this piece is that this is the Omphalos stone. So this is a carbon stone. And is it hollow inside? It is hollow inside.
Yes. Yeah.
So it's a representation of something else, because we also see later a meteorite at the Omphalos site. Isn't that a meteorite that is the Omphalos? because that's a
Yeah,
stone.
that conical stone. Yeah, you're right. It's almost like a 3D image of something else.
And so that is not this. This is not that. They're somehow, they might represent the same thing, but they are not the same thing. So
Yep.
that makes me think, and we're not going to talk about it today, but that makes me think that my theory is even more possibly correct.
Yeah, well, you're hinting at something that we've discussed, which is a bit more of an Occam's razor kind of view as to what that design represents and what function it could have had for an actual meteorite.
Because it's representing, you know what I'm saying, is if it's supposedly a beehive that represents a meteorite and they turned it into a beehive because somehow the bee is going back into the space that was once holding the meteorite. So it's occupying and maybe performing a function spiritually that the meteorite is forming over here. And so the inflow stone is saying, see, this is what we're talking about, the void. The bees are going into the void. The bees are going into this meteorite, the bee energy and and look, it's coming out because they're saying bees came from souls. Bees came from the goddess, you know, bees came from space, the moon goddess.
And this is the navel stone. It's the center of the earth.
Right. And if it's the center of the earth, is that the place where the space, outer world and inner world meet? If that's the center of the earth, is that also the space? You know, like we keep thinking of it as center of the earth because that's our way of being told what they said, told what that means, but is the meaning deeper to saying this is this point, you know, this is the place where you enter space. That is the oracle. Listen to the oracle.
Yeah.
It's the oracle stone. Listen to it. Put your ear up to it. And maybe over here is the meteorite, which is the same vibe, different day.
And maybe this hole in the stone created a sound.
It obvious always, dude. When you're in front of the beehive, that's one of the things. Remember when we were at Findhorn? I don't know. I laid down underneath the mouth of the beehive. And I experienced knowledge from the bees. I don't know if you remember, if that was when you were there, if it was the next time I went, but what I did was I laid in front of the beehive and it was in the north, you know, Findhorn is really far north and the wind was just blowing hard from the east and it blows from the east all the time. And the bees were up against this hedgerow, but the wind was blowing this way. And I knew when I went in, I was like, what are you doing? And they said, and the man there said, well, Anna Breitenbach, who's an animal communicator, said that bees wanted to be right here next to the hedge. And so I was like, okay, wow, that's, as a beekeeper, I'm not sure that's what I would do with it because this cold, stiff breeze and the beekeeper said, yeah, the breeze is always coming from that way. And the openings were pointed that direction. I mean, maybe turn them around possibly, or put them on the other side of the hedge because the breeze, right? So anyway, I laid down in front of him and my body all of a sudden felt like I had thousands of bees on top of my body going, wow. And they were feeling the cold wires that were in the hive and all the wires that they had going through. And they were showing me a net of cold wires on my body. And that was the first time I experienced physically the communication like that of the bees being my body. You know what I'm saying?
Really cool.
Yeah.
Really?
So I can only assume that priestesses at those times, who are far more accomplished than me ever will be, were able to achieve even greater. And I've achieved more different kinds of really super esoteric things from the same sitting at the mouth of the beehive. That's the ultimate priestessing for a bee priestess.
Yeah. No, totally. So having received confirmation at Delphi that, it's the right thing to do is to go to Turkey to get the meteorite known as Kabelli. And this is what it looks like as you're approaching her temple, and obviously it's ancient, it's in ruins, but you had to then go through this passage that was filled with water because you had to be cleansed before you could arrive at the temple. And the temple, look at it's small, right? It's a very intimate space, and this cube-shaped stone is where Kabele the meteorite lied on top of. And I noticed a small sort of shiny bit of stone, and I scraped away the moss, and you can see that really the entire underneath of this stone was crystalline, which was so interesting. And there you can see the scale of it. And yeah, that's where the greatest manifestation of Kabele that ever has been, a meteorite, was taken back to Rome. And there's a lot of pop and circumstance that happens when Kabele is brought back to Rome, but just kind of not a random or not an unrelated, but a very specific example of Elagabalus, Rome's heretic king, who is the god of the mountain, which is very similar to Kabele's mountain mother. He has his own sort of idea about a black stone, and there's coins made that show the black stone in his temple, and he takes Kabele and all the other gods and goddesses in Rome and brings them into his temple, but they're all kind of subservient to this black stone from Syria.
Wow.
Which is where he comes from. And so it's another black conical meteorite. What's interesting about that is it doesn't stand alone in history. There's black stones and meteorites that have been revered very similarly, such as this one in the alleged temple of Aphrodite in Cyprus. And there's no reference to this stone being associated with Aphrodite. It's just the Queen of Cyprus that it's associated with. And she was said, the stone, to have been worshipped in Syria, again, where the black stone that the heretic king in Rome brought to Rome. So I just think it's really interesting that the black stone, the meteorite, tends to be renowned as the goddess.
And I could see, and I'm going to make a different case about the shape, but I could see that it is both conical and yet has flat sides to it. So this concept of cube, Kababa, Kabele, this Kaaba shape, that word has some kind of reference to structure, a structure.
I like that. And, for example, like touche. I mean, we have a Ben stone from Dajur, and it's a meteorite, and so much symbolism, so little time, really.
Right.
We will go deep into Egypt and the misunderstood symbolism of obelisk. It's always been thought that meteorites or stones from heaven were the gifts from the goddess. Yeah, that's not untrue, but they have been kind of turned into a masculine thing, when in fact, probably just the opposite is what's really true.
Or the combination. It's hard for us because we grow up in this world of dichotomous thinking, good, bad, black, white, male, female. And we're now in an era where that's no longer true. We're starting to understand that the encompassing nature of the divine feminine exists within the masculine. The masculine exists within the divine feminine. And that's what the bees show us, is that because the goddess parthenogenically creates the masculine without aid of semen, and is able to create the male offspring strictly from her body. So the divine feminine does not exclude or even exist in opposite. Matriarchy or matrifocalism, matriarchy is just the opposite of patriarchy. Matrifocalism is the inclusion of all beings. with the mother at the center. And, you know, the one symbol, which I'm just going to point to, we're not going to necessarily discuss, but yes, that circle in the middle, everybody that's going to follow this podcast, keep that one in mind, because we're going to get to that, and it's big later. And I think it's far more feminine than it's ever been given credit in Egyptology.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mhm.
And, you know, Kybele, we're used to seeing her on our chariot flanked by two lions. So it begs, and for me, it's always begged the question, are we talking about a celestial event? Leo, the constellation, the chariot moving through the sky. I've looked into it. I haven't found anything to my satisfaction that resonates, but my gut tells me there's something there.
I'll give you one. How about the original Sphinx before it became that emperor's head? You know, was it? And when they were doing the pyramids, because, you know, I know you know this, but the Sphinx is much, 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 much older than modern historians tell us, possibly by like thousands, tens of thousands of years. Like, and what the reason why the head is so small compared to the body is that it was shrunk down from a period of time when it existed in rain or flood, that it was buried up to its shoulders and the only thing exposed was the head. And then it eroded a lot. And then the emperor or the pharaoh to whom it's dedicated did it in his likeness. And then everybody says that's when it started. But really, that was a remodel of it tens of thousands of years potentially after it was first built. And was it a lion's head? Because astrological sign of Leo, when was that? I don't know. But when was the planet under the eon of the Leo? We know that certain writers talked about where lions roamed, women rule, and then we see the lion with not only this modern Kybele, but all the way back into Catal Huyuk, which is how old? 30,000, 20,000 years old, 10,000 years old.
And to add to that mystique of possibility, the Minoans, who were the world's greatest bee-loving culture, and we'll look into that. If it doesn't resonate with people, we'll go deep into that in another episode. But they were just massive bee-venerating people. We've lost their language. We don't have their language anymore, except for one word, which means bee, and it's spelled SPHEX.
Exactly. Why, right?
Coincidence? Perhaps, but wow, just wow. And, yeah, so this image for me, this is just flowing through time on this chariot with the lions is my favorite image of Kybele. And here she is with the goddess Nike. But what are they looking at? A woman up on an altar with a stone that's being venerated. And that stone, and even that size of the stone, seems to be how the meteorite of Kybele was shown in art. It wasn't shown as this big piece that sat on the stone we saw earlier. They show it as just logically being a small kind of almost baseball size stone. And there it is. So
I can imagine this makes me think of that green block that you first showed us in that earlier slide. Like, would a green block be the one by her knees?
Yeah.
Back with the other things, because also if we had something that was as precious, oh, look, somebody's coming into this from out of town. Should we let her in, or should we? She's from Ireland. No, it's off time. What I'm telling you is that somebody is just entered our waiting room for Bees in Space.
Oh, right.
Yeah, and they're from Ireland. But I could let them in, and we could just keep talking.
Okay, yeah.
As if we're not even noticing them, just letting them in. Okay, so I'll do it now. So it reminds me of that green stone that you mentioned in one of your earlier slides, where it is let me do this. where it is that green stone is an altar stone, and then we're adding to what was on top of the altar stone. And I think something as precious as a meteorite, we're not carrying around big chunks. We're talking around potentially just small slivers. And wouldn't they put them in a box or in a special vessel that had, that everybody knew what was in there, but that's what it was. You didn't have to like show it all the time to indicate what it was.
Yeah, and even fast forwarding quite a bit in future episodes, the Black Stone at Mecca is a collection of meteorites that are kind of meshed together and stitched together. They used to be, for some time, separate. So to your point, it's an embodiment of a larger meteorite, but it's just as sacred as the bigger stone.
Exactly.
So for me, the Great Flood, we all think about the story of Noah. And one of the things that I think is really forgotten is one of the strangest parts of the Old Testament is that Noah, he survives this incredible arduous journey, and apparently he needs a drink, and who can blame him? First thing he does is plant a vineyard. Interesting detail, but nowhere near as interesting as the fact that he's shamed because they find him naked and drunk in his tent. He never made it to his bed. What a disrespectful thing to include about a patriarch. Why wasn't that edited out? They left it in there, and it's just such an unusual detail. Hold that thought and then realize that the ancient word for swarm and grape was the same.
Well,
so swarm, grape.
I love that because that alludes to this ancient practice of entheogenic ecstasy. And so wine was considered the body of the god or goddess, and possibly Dionysian, right? Dionysian rituals were being done before this. And what better way to shame a culture that you're trying to sublimate by saying, oh, they did this Dionysian rite. He wasn't even able to get to his bed. So like the swarm and the grape they're just like sensual pleasures, and we're Christians now. So it's a way to put something down. It's kind of like, this isn't your prom night. Like, you need to calm down. This isn't your wedding. It's like you're putting down, like, don't be a bridezilla. You're like putting down the fact that this bride wants to have the wedding her way by making this connotation of like, you're being a monster. So it's kind of like that to him. Like, first thing he did was plant a vineyard because he didn't get to have, maybe he had chicken eggs, but he didn't have anything fresh and wine and ecstasy and pleasure, or mead, right?
Yeah, and you have hallucinogenic honey in many parts of Anatolia, unique in the world in its potency, and so for me it's interesting because now when you think about all these images of ancient Dionysus grapes, I just can't help but wonder, was it really grapes or was it honey? I don't know. It's kind of a lateral sort of speculation.
I think the grapes as wine is a more modern interpretation of bee swarms, and that in the first time, and when next session episode, when we do our pilgrimages, let's bring this up again. So save that slide and let's bring it up next then, and let's talk about it. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Because I know some real strong connections, but go ahead, keep going.
No, fantastic. So Noah, he survives the flood. But what would have caused a flood? And there's records of global floods all across the world. Every region reports a flood. What comets would have caused that? Certainly, meteorites would have caused that. And so Noah's Ark arrives where? Mount Ararat, but Mount Ararat is a mountain range, and the sort of sophisticated historian today acknowledges that it was Judea, which is right on the border of Turkey and Syria. And I've been there. I've gone up near the top. Isis was holding out on the top of the mountain, so you had to be quite careful.
We mean you mean the military ISIS, not the goddess.
Military ISIS. Thank you. Yes. Not the goddess. I would not have been. I would have gravitated to the top and not stopped just short of it. But as I approached it, boom, beehives, and it just the synergy of knowing that story about Noah, and look at the middle of nowhere. It's beehives. What are they going to possibly? And people are thinking, well, this isn't Mount Ararat. It can't be the place. Well, it is the place. It's the place because even the Hittite kings at the time had reliefs made of them holding a piece of the ark because they knew this is where Noah came to rest. And so I just think it's an interesting sort of side jaunt into meteorites and floods and Noahs. And so my final slide of bees and sacred stones, going back to the navel stone from Delphi. The word bee in Egyptian is bit, and it carries the same numeric value as meteorite. And that just, for me, that just like blows my mind, because in numerology, that's really significant.
That proves the point that we just make that earlier in this presentation where we were saying like, okay, yeah, that was the beehive. There wasn't an actual meteorite in it, but it was the sound of space. You know,
Yes,
the cosmic voice, the sound of the void.
And I'd like to look into what else is 443, because there's probably going to be more synergistic objects and things, but that is just so profound. And
yes.
Add to that, you have Wolfgang Eschenbach, who writes Parsifal. Eschenbach was a historian, never, ever, ever wrote fiction. And he got all his information about the Grail being a stone from heaven from the troubadours. The troubadours are an Iranian tribe called the Alans, who changed their name to troubadours when they came to France. That's where Eschenbach gets his information from. So Parsifal and the Grail being a stone from heaven, is a historical account, not fiction. Which is, again, I think is mind-boggling, because Kybele is a meteorite and she's a bee goddess. The oracle stone, Rhea, the stone that she uses to save Zeus's life. There's something there with bees and stones and meteorites that we have forgotten.
And something I think that happens right at this shift in human consciousness from probably pre-flood into a post-flood agricultural animal husbandry Bronze Age kind of understanding. So a more masculine understanding of the planet. It's less focused on birth and more focused on power over the landscape and being gods yourselves, like Zeus, like creating things. Now humans can be the hands of the goddess.
Yeah, absolutely. And that brings us on to some of your analysis after the a replay of the image here of Rhea giving a stone to her husband to save the life of Zeus. Oh, this looks familiar.
Right. So last time when we were talking about Kybele, about Catal Huyuk, we said that we wanted to talk about Kybele. And this time, and we mentioned that she had many, many names. And this image on the left is taken from inside of the museum, which is in Selçuk, Turkey, which is a town near Ephesus in Western Turkey. And this is where they have a lot of these figurines of Ana Tanrika, the mother goddess, which is this Kybele form that we see and we talked about before. And this area, it has been established that Artemis, this image you see on the right, which is a replica of Ephesus, and this is on my altar. And this is the same place where the Kybele was worshipped for a long time. So her temple, which was rebuilt 7 times, was built on an ancient Kybelean temple.
Amazing.
Yeah, so we know that this most likely is just, over time morphed into this other more complicated figure that's helping to describe their understanding of their own cosmology. And we'll get into this later, because I'm going in our next episode, we're going to be talking about our pilgrimages and my pilgrimage to this icon, which has the soil of her temple rubbed into the groove. So next slide. So one of the things that we talked about last time is the iconography of her body. So I'd like to just talk about it just for a second. She has a little wreath on top of her head, which later morphs into holding a veil or holding a mural crown, which or a column. So over time, you'll see this headdress shift from the simple wreath to a larger and larger crown. And she's very pendulous, what is kind of described as obese or fertile. It would be very uncommon for women to be this size during this time. That would be a very specialized type of person, that to be able to consume to that level. But she's always flanked by lions. So this is a reference, I think, to either one of the things that we do know is the ancient Greeks said that where lions roam, women or goddesses rule. And this may be from not only just the landscape, like up in the mountains, you're going to see more lions than down in the valleys where there's agriculture and cities. And so a lot of mountains were dedicated to Magna Mater or Kybele. And then also we see that in more ancient, maybe in the zodiac time of Leo was the time when goddesses rule. A lot of mythologies talk about that long ago time when women ruled that no longer exists. Lots of ancient philosophies talk about that. So the other part about it is she's got this pendulous breast, these 2 lions, the crown, and then between her knees is a birthing child, or the head of a birthing child, which could be reference to parthenogenesis, meaning creating life from yourself without, it could be reference to this, like the Zeus type baby being born of the goddess, her son, So,
And is it fair to say that Kybele is typically shown as a middle-aged woman?
right. It's not, and in a place of ancestor worship, this older, wiser, having produced children, it's proof that she produced children, is a lot better. If this woman had a baby, and this woman, you don't even know if she can have a baby, that's different value system. And then the wisdom, that's one of the things about the crown. It indicates I know something, so, and I make good decisions. I'm a thinker,
Nice.
Yeah, wisdom. Next slide. So when we were talking about Catal Huyuk, we were talking about a lot of the former historians would say, look how quickly and casually and roughly this is made. But we see consistency throughout time. We see this not only put into garbage bins, but found buried with grain or in burial chambers. So you don't usually bury garbage with people. You don't usually put garbage in your grain stores, but you might throw away something that served its purpose on a magical level and needed to be regenerated and made every year. So if every person in your family wanted to make a new goddess, or every head of household or woman in the household, maybe they would all sit around and they would get their lump of clay and they'd all do exactly the same. And they would try to make them very, very similar and have them for their family. Oh, hello. Did we have a comment from the gallery? Jill, I saw Jill pop up. Well, we'll keep going. So
do we think, I mean, this is what, 8,000-9,000 years old, this statue. Do we think that the ravages of time have eroded the accents of hair, or do you think she was intentionally without hair?
Maybe what it was a place to tie on a veil, I've often thought that, like it's hard to tie if somebody wanted to dress this sculpture, like and make it an icon for their house, like put it on their mantle, or something like that, then maybe they dress it up. Like women everywhere love to dress up dolls and babies and everything. Maybe there's a veil that goes over it, and that's a way that you can tie the veil on. It doesn't slip off the head, so you've got a place to anchor a rope, and you can put a veil on it, because her character is veiled by the time she gets to be Rhea and so forth. She's always veiled later. So the other thing I think is you're onto something. The specific nature of that belly marking is, whether it's a bull's face or a bee's face or this Anak, wait, what's that god? Vinca, the god Vinca. We're going to get into it another time, but really interesting. So we can't assume that because we look at it one way, that it doesn't have other existing
That's right. That's
meaning.
right.
Because when
Yeah.
you look at the back of this, yeah,
Mm.
it's a booty and everything, but look, there's a bump in the middle, a hump in the middle of her back, these two deep grooves, these balloon-like arms. What is the back saying that might have another type? Look, her spine is buried in there with these big flabs of fat. Like, what is this? Yeah, what is going on? Like, we don't know. There could be additional references or reasons, to have
Yeah.
these different shapes like that. So,
Yeah.
but my ultimate point is that the fact that there's so many of them, the fact that they are casually made, the fact that we find them both in garbage bins and in burial chambers and in special greeneries, means that it has a potency that is cyclical and necessary for every household.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
it increases the power of it rather than decreases. Just think about how powerful the Christian cross is. And you can find plastic ones at the thrift store in the bottom of a bag of garbage. Like it,
Yeah.
just because you found a piece of plastic doesn't mean that somebody there wouldn't stake their life on it.
But this statue has a half-life of potency, but and after that it's no longer potent, and it's okay to dispose of, apparently.
Or it's so important and so potent that you have to bury it so that it can regenerate. Like, you don't want to keep these around because you're not doing regeneration.
I mean, I've had debates with people in their homes when the crucifix of Christ on the wall fell and broke, but you can't throw it out. You can't put that in the no, you're going to rot in hell if you put that in the rubbish bin. But maybe this was thought of in a slightly different way.
Well, trash midden would have a different thing for people, like if you're just throwing away things that eventually turn to soil, it's different than we do. Like, I got to figure out what to do with my freaking broken tape recorder, like that's a different kind of garbage than what garbage that's made of clay and bones and plant material. That's
biodegradable.
Yeah, that's soil. That's regeneration. That isn't waste. It's regenerative material.
Yeah, it's a really good point. That's a really good point.
Mm-hmm. And so this is I have a copy of this by my bedside. So this is a version that still exists into the Roman era. So we can see that they've turned her into this other type of figure, but
slightly younger.
Yeah, and always the lion, always the lion. And that was also in reference to a classical style of beauty, because now we have, a whole different arts form and stylized. I mean, this is marble. The other one was handmade clay, but it's the same, symbols coming through. But I love her. I think she's beautiful. And it reminds me of being a Leo, also the Chariot tarot card.
Yeah.
And, and the familiarity, like she and that lion are besties, they're familiar with each other. They love each other. This lion is bearing her comfortably.
Yeah, it's very true. Very true. Oh, wow.
And then this is, we were talking about Kybele, right? With the lions on either side. Well, this is a close up of Artemis. And you could see that she has this necklace of dates, I believe. And she has these lions on her shoulders, and she has griffins, which are spiritual, potent, maybe even space beings, Andrew, representative of space beings. that are lion-headed with wings and the body of, I think, rams or something like that. But on her breast is astrology. Now, in those days, they were moving from the lunar astrology to solar astrology. And so this to me is a marcation of patriarchy enveloping this more ancient Kybele and saying, okay, this goddess of the moon is central to the ancient feminine astrology. Now we're shifting it, still keeping her at the center there as the moon goddess, but we're shifting it to the masculine. And they're starting to show like the twins and the lion and all these different ones, not necessarily in order either. And now we can see that the column is forming on the top, indicating that she's civilization builder. And then what is that around her head? Well, that's space. That's the what is that called?
Halo.
That's her halo. But importantly, I want to say that I think the blackness of her features is a nod toward a more ancient truth of this goddess form coming up from potentially African and native, because truly the mother goddess of all humanity is a brown-skinned woman.
And it has a real strong Black Madonna quality to it, of course. And the Black Madonna arguably could be an ode to the Black Meteorite that's been worshipped, as we've shown, for thousands of years.
Well, let's go to the next slide, because I'm going to find us a little, I've got a few other cookie crumbs here. So here's Artemis of Ephesus there on the right, and it's a slightly different form. These forms get remade by different artists over time. And you can see her more full form with her hands open like this because she's generous. And it's a very controversial story about what's hanging at her midriff. We'll talk about that in another time. But so we can see that she was potentially carved from a stone based on very likely the Kybelean origin. And we can see also with Kybele, you see how she has that veil hanging down, Andrew? Wouldn't it be easier to attach a veil to the Kybelean with you had a ring on it? Because then you could tie it. If you just tied something, anybody with babies knows, you can't just tie something around their head. You know, it needs to, you know, you need to have it like elastic or something, or else it'll just zinc off the head, right? So
I like that.
Yeah,
that makes a lot of sense.
Practical associations, I think, with some of these things. Just because you see it in clay doesn't mean there wasn't a whole bunch of other stuff, ochre and paint and material and things in the hands or on the laps or libations that were poured over. We don't have those kinds of, you know, features because this is 4,000 or 9,000 or 15,000 years old or whatever. So next slide. So here is that Madonna again. Now we saw, so we see this direct reference from the Artemisian goddess to this Mother Mary goddess. And you can see that not only is it a Black Madonna, we also have to remember that throughout the world where brown-skinned people live, there are indigenous goddesses that when Christianity came were very powerful. And so Christianity may have adopted you know, these goddesses into their form of Mother Mary, absorbed it in order to bring in those people into worship in the Christian Catholic, you know, story. But in her hand shows that she had, that's a globe that shows that she, and you see this in like the Queen of England or something might hold one of these. And it means the terrestrial, have the terrestrial ownership of the terrestrial kingdom, right? Terrestrial landscape. And then she has her child, of course, Jesus, and she sits on a throne. But there's these similarities here with the veil, you know, and so forth. So next slide.
Yeah, no, I can really see it.
And it's even more obvious when you look at this, because she doesn't have the baby between her knees, but her knees are open and her baby sits on her knees. You don't put a baby on your lap with your knees open, because they'll just fall through. So it's really indicating to me, this is like a little more, it's a little, you know, and, but also look just totally similar, exact same wreath around the head. Look at how you would apply a veil to this.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a really good point. I see it. I think you got something there.
And then also when we think about Catal Huyuk, like we mentioned before, by the time this goddess figurine was being put in these agricultural establishments, the landscape had been overhunted. So a lot of these wild animals, which we saw heavily represented in the mural drawings and so forth, and in these kinds of figurines in Catal Huyuk, were really not that common anymore. So we're maintaining this goddess from a previous culture. And then by the time Mary comes around, we've forgotten about the lions, and they no longer are needed there because they don't live there, and they haven't lived there for 3,000 to 9,000 years by the time
and all you have to do is blink, and now the whole mastery of the animals has become a masculine thing. And you know, Saint Francis of Assisi, and he's the one who has the mastery of the animals. But really,
yeah, in one of my courses, I teach on how this form morphs into the most recent one is a Greek saint who got rid of the plague by tying a witch in his yard. When she started out as the all-mother goddess and ends up as a witch staked in the yard of a Christian saint. So her form changes. I mean, even like in every culture, Freya, bee goddess, Brigid, Ireland, bee goddess, you know, Gobnate, Ireland, bee goddess, Brahmari Devi, Ireland, India, bee goddess, you know, Mother, even Christianity, we have all of these honey and everything, all is in Christianity and Islam. There's all this scripture in Islam. I mean, it's just everywhere, but let's keep going.
Yeah. And but even today, Dr. Dolittle is another masculine ripoff of what started with the mother goddess.
But we do have little Greta Thunberg, who is a good example of somebody who's taking care of animals on an archetypal level. But what we do know is that whether or not these goddesses were formed to honor our African origins, or to honor the African origins of this information, possibly, it could be because they were making it out of this black stone. And so here is one of these black stones, which, as we've discussed, is a meteorite. And Andrew, you showed this slide earlier. So let's go to the next one. And we discussed that these two things are different things. The one on the right is the Omphalos stone. Wait. The one on the right is the navel stone, and the one on the left is the Omphalos. And the Omphalos is hollow with a beehive in it, and this interesting pattern, which we'll discuss in a future episode. And the one on the right looks like it's more related to these Benben stones or meteorite stones, and maybe some kind of the
conical shape.
Yeah, and the conical shape, as we've discussed, may be an interpretation of, look, it came down here like a shooting star. It has a point, and you know, there is a reason why it has a point. It was a shooting star. A lot of them are oblong shaped, but let's keep going. So when you talked about this, it really dawned on me, and you had mentioned this, that this was an altar stone to the meteorite. And what made me think of is that this chamber, this white stone, would be a perfect place to put a beautiful black meteorite. That white would reflect all kinds of shimmering, glittery white would reflect all kinds of lights back into this dark black stone that would maybe even look like the void. Some of these stones were iron, and they would have a certain magnetism to them, especially if you're not used to experiencing a magnetic field like we are in modern eras. That might be a very, wow, what is this? You would feel it. And did this chamber have lions in it to protect this amazing stone? Did they put,
you know, I did something here that I'm really quite ashamed of, and I'm not sure if I wrote about it or I took it out of my article about it. But as I stood here, I'm the only person in the entire place. There's nobody around for hundreds of yards in any direction. And I took a big stone
from the area,
right here, and I lifted it over my head. And I started pounding it.
Why?
Pounding it violently, pounding it right on top of that, and just pounding it, pounding it. And I must have done that for 30 or 45 seconds, as hard as you could physically pound that altar stone. And I just I woke up and I was just like, what the hell are you doing? What?
My God, you got to work out some past life stuff now.
No, what I got
Uh-huh.
was I was awakening it. And I felt shame because I was like, what the hell are you doing? This is a sacred. Oh God, yeah. I felt like nobody had acknowledged it. You had to do some work and go talk to a guy way over there to find out where this was, because it's not marked.
I am so with you. I'm going to share an awakening story about something very similar in our pilgrimage story. This is amazing information. I'm glad you told me, and I'm sorry I rushed to judgment. I really appreciate
it was the right judgment to make, because it's a bizarre thing to be hammering, but it resonated afterwards. That's why I did it, because I don't think it had been acknowledged for a long time.
All I can say is boys are weird.
Yeah, well, you're not wrong about that.
Okay, next slide.
Moving on.
When you mentioned that was potentially a altar seat of a meteorite, I just had to find out more, and I'm mortified that this picture on the left is so poor, and hopefully in post-production I can find a better one. But what it's showing is an image of the beehive cluster, which has nothing to do with anything necessarily that we're talking about, or does it? But it's a cluster of stars that supposedly have not been able to be seen until we have telescopes. And it's at the center of the constellation Cancer. It's called the Crib, or the beehive cluster. Now, I believe that people back in the olden days had maybe better eyesight, maybe better brains that were more equipped to process information about the natural world. And the myths talk about the Seven Pleiades. And when we look at the sky now, very, very, very few people can see that seventh star, but yet it was widely known that the constellation had 7 stars in it. So, do we have, is this, what did people know about it before? I don't know, but I just thought it was interesting. So next.
Yeah, no, I love it. Very interesting.
But I think what's really more relevant to our story is what Graham Hancock talks about is this Torrid Complex, which is a meteor shower that comes around twice a year, but it peaks every 2,000 to 3,000 years. And the story about one of the Greek stories about Taurus is that it is there to protect the Pleiades from Orion the Hunter. And Orion the Hunter is actually Artemis's boyfriend. So there's a bee connection, because Artemis is the mother bee. So that's an interesting connection. And another interesting connection that does refer to bees in space is that the Pleiades, many spiritual mythologies talk about bees coming from the Pleiades, or souls coming from the Pleiades. So we can see in this image that the Pleiades are in the South Torrid radiance. So shooting stars. Next slide.
Well, and this is such an important slide, just because it's just dawning on me that I've seen images of Artemis, the celestial Artemis, killing the bull.
Right. And you know why? Because her brother tricked her. She had a best friend named Orion. They loved each other. They did everything together. They hunted together. They were best friends. They were equals. They ran equally side by side everywhere they went. They were like best friends. And they were also lovers. She loved him. And of course, Apollo got jealous. And so one day he took Orion and threw him as far as he could in the middle of the ocean. And Artemis was like, oh my God, where's Orion? I was going to go hang out with him, and he's gone. And he's like, oh, Apollo goes, oh, you see that guy out there? I threw him out there to get rid of him. He killed Orion. That guy out there killed Orion. And so Artemis went, oh, that asshole, and like shot her arrow and killed him. And she's like, oh my God, when she realized Apollo tricked her and killed basically his rival, the equal to his sister, whereas he became the dominant of the two eventually in patriarchy. But she went out there and she was so mortified that she had killed him that she took him by the belt, Orion's belt, and threw him up into heavens to keep him in the stars and so everybody could see him forever. He would never be hidden again. So the fact that later she's protecting the Pleiades from Orion, it's from the idea that Apollo put in their head, kill it because it's dangerous, but that was a lie to begin with. That was her best friend.
And
he was jealous.
And Artemis killing the bull and bees coming forth out of the bull is something you're going to see for thousands of years to come in Egyptology, in Lyell's golden syrup, in the story of Samson. You're going to have big animals like bulls being killed and bees coming out of the carcass. Is this where that mythology comes from?
Interesting, really interesting. Let's keep going because we're going to come back to that, but there's another reference. So this is what it might look like, right? With the meteor shower, this is a Toroidan meteor shower. So in the ancient time when we didn't have lights and we didn't have dynamite and we didn't have movies and all this stuff, this would have been quite a show. It comes around every year. Well, at this time in the Bronze Age, it was peaking out. The next time it peaks out, Andrew talked about it, was during the Roman time, 2,000 to 3,000 years later, when they go back to these to try to retrieve these meteorites so that they can return to, that they can be saved, right? So they try to get that black stone so that they can consult the black stone to stop these showers of meteorites that are hitting the earth and causing explosions and fires and floods and everything. So they're reaching into their knowledge, ancestral knowledge of, oh, the last time this happened, we found this black stone. So let's go to the next slide. And so Andrew showed me a slide similar to this many years ago. And it's part of the story that we're going to talk about later about the movement of this meteor, or movement potentially of a holy relic from, this is in Egypt by Luxor in the house of Sais, which is the house of the bee, which is for the goddess Neith. It's the first college in Egypt. Neith is a very pre-Egyptian origin goddess of the region. And anyway, they have this picture in multiple places as well, I think in cave art also, but of a square object being carried by a boat. And we can see that there's this bull carcassy image up above and all these little dots in the middle. So could it be that the meteorite is, and I just am thinking of this right now, the meteorite is being moved on this boat because it's a cube. It's a reference to the cube. And maybe it was housed in a container that bees moved into. Maybe it was covered by a bull hide and bees moved into it. But regardless, I think that this points potentially to this meteorite being carried in a square container, and these arms on either side of the container are so that people can lift it up when they take it out of the boat, and it's being moved from Africa. That's my idea. So let's go to the next slide. So I thought, well, was there any asteroids in Africa? Well, here's one, a big square one, a big cube. This one, her name is Hoba, and it comes from the indigenous people's word, the indigenous people, Kokogoa people, and it means gift. It's the biggest natural piece of iron on the planet. And it doesn't have a crater because it came in at a real acute angle. And the article that I was reading, one of the articles I was reading about it, said that it didn't have a crater because it was, quote, greatly amused by the Earth's atmosphere.
Nice turn of phrase.
I know. So anyway, originally it was 66 tons and it arrived on the planet 60,000 years ago.
Wow, a lot of sixes.
And it's now 60 tons because of erosion and people chunking off parts of it and carrying it away. So was this one of the types of stones that might have been the mother stone 60,000 years ago, a mother stone of this meteorite? I just thought that was really interesting. And there it is. There's a person, that's not me, but this is actually taken in the 60s when it was first sort of quote unquote like well, it was like a National Geographic expose about this. And this is what it looks like today. Sort of gives you a size of it. And then there it is when it was.
Oh, I thought it was you when I first saw it there.
I know. That's why I included it. I thought, oh, that's about what I would look like sitting on it. So maybe someday. Bucket list.
Nice. Nice.
And
Ooh.
then this is a piece of nickel, and nickel and iron are common on M-type asteroids, and that is considered the source of iron meteorites. So this mineral or this element is present in asteroids. Now, asteroids are pieces of rocks and things that are flying around the planet, and meteorites are pieces of those asteroids that hit the planet. So an asteroid is great big, and meteorites are usually smaller in chunks of it. So the coolest thing that I found out about asteroids and meteorites is that they were once the core of protoplanets. So when the Big Bang happened and the Earth became a planet and all these other planets formed, there were other planets that were forming, but because they were too close to the sun or they crashed into something else, they kept exploding over time. And sometimes the mass of everything that's coming together would create a nuclear type fusion, and they would explode because of the amount of pressure that's forming in their formation. But anyway, when we have a meteorite land on Earth, we have to understand that these pieces of material were made at the same time the planet herself was made. So they're literally billions of years old, with nothing other than space having touched it since it, landed on Earth. Like only the humans that meet these are the first ones to see it since it was created at the time the Earth was created.
It's amazing.
And how profound that is. So
yeah.
This is one of the ingredients that would go into it, and it has that cubic shape, which nowadays people studying geometry have created something called the hypercube, which is a geometry that you can see at the center of the symbol for the College of the Melissa. It's a hypercube. This is a dimensional, a diagram to understand what another dimension is. We're used to 3D. This is 4D.
Yeah, you can see it just jumping off the page, isn't it?
And was that idea formed from people who could read and listen with their big brains and their resonant body, the wisdom within that, and called it Kubaba, called it Kaaba, called it Kybele, called it Kuba.
Totally.
Next
slide. I like that.
Yeah,
I like that.
So this is a little place called this is where a meteorite called the Winona Meteorite was housed, and this is called a stone cyst, meaning like, I don't know, a place to store it. I don't know what it means, but this was found in the prehistoric Eldon Pueblo in the Arizona, and this Winona, these fragments here, are from a Canyon Diablo meteorite that happened 50,000 years ago. So Hoba came 60,000 years ago. Then 50,000 years ago came the Winona fragments, and they're iron, and they were traded up and down all around the Americas at long time ago. And so this was worshipped, and the way it was stored and how it was recorded in situ in the site, according to people that are studying this, archaeologists, they say that they witnessed it, that the humans that stored this witnessed it 50,000 years ago. And then also Rebecca, friend of the college, one of the Rahiba of the college, she said that the snake mound that's 12,000 feet long, I think she said, in the somewhere in the southeast.
In Ohio, yeah.
Ohio,
the Circle Mound.
That is made at the site of a meteorite crater.
Yeah,
so they made that big earth mound in the trail of where, so they saw the snake coming into earth and made this. Yeah. So next slide. So I love that in our own indigenous people, having had these stories and places, we can touch a little bit of what those Greek and Egyptian and Anatolian experience, because we have a more recent culture that can tell us, a living culture, still living culture. For example, this one is the Willamette Meteorite, which came to where, close to where I grew up in Portland, Oregon. And when it arrived on the planet, this one, let's see, this is the Willamette one. I didn't know if I wrote down when it came. I got to look that up. I'll figure it out. But anyway, it was when I was a girl, it was, I think for a long time. Let me say that. Let me start over. The Willamette Meteorite showed up in Portland, Oregon, or near Portland, Oregon, when it, and it still is the land of the Clackamas people. The Clackamas people now have a land in LaRonde, Oregon, but before, when this was the Willamette Valley, was the home and is the home, the ancestral lands of the Clackamas people. So this is the 6th largest meteorite in the world. It's the largest one ever found in the United States. And it is iron and 15.5 tons. And there are only 600 of the 25,000 meteorites found. Only 600 of them are made of iron. So the fact that this is so old, that it was formed inside, this one in particular, they're saying it was formed inside of a star with nuclear fusion, and then was sent so close to the sun that the outside core, any kind of material on the outside, melted away, and all that was left was a burning core. So it circled the sun for a long time and then shattered by colliding with another planet, they think, and it pinballed into space and was hit at least twice over the years. And then it landed in the United States in Portland, and the rainwater would collect on it and create and interacted with the iron sulfide of the stone and would create sulfuric acid, which would further eat out the cavities. So that the people, the Clackamas people, would collect the rainwater and considered it healing and purifying, and would dip their arrows in it to make their arrows stronger. And so this was also worshipped and studied and understood for its chemistry, and being that it was iron. Can you imagine how that would feel coming up next to it? You know, there must have been magnetism associated.
I love the fact that it ends up in Oregon, which becomes the forefathers of America's region that was called Deseret, the honeybee.
Right. Wow. Interesting.
Fate.
Yeah. Next slide. Definitely influential. So this is just this is taking the concept and the symbolism literally into outer space. So this is the 2nd asteroid ever visited by a human spacecraft, and it's the first one that we ever saw that had its own moon. People assumed it had moons, but they weren't sure until they got these pictures back from a 1993 expedition Galileo that was on its way to Jupiter. So what's cool is it's on its way to Jupiter, which is a Roman name for Zeus, which could be a Greco-Roman interpretation of the baby born of Kybele, right?
Yeah.
And this particular asteroid is a silicate asteroid, and it's from the Coronis family of asteroids. So Cronus, and then which is the husband of Rhea that was eating all the babies. So Rhea took the baby away, gave Kronos the asteroid, or gave him the meteorite and hid.
Yeah.
So Coronis, the family of asteroids, kind of interesting.
It's incredible.
Yeah,
really.
Yeah, some geeky guy who we love him. He was a brewer. He made beer, and he was an amateur astronomer. And he, of course, named this asteroid Ida after the nymph that cared for Zeus, fed him honey, right? And then the moon they named Dactyl for the creatures that lived on Mount Ida in Crete. So next slide.
That's just amazing.
Right? And so the coolest thing about Mount Ida, here it is, and Andrew showed his slide of this cave there. Well, this cave, not only is it the birth of Zeus, but in generations and centuries and a millennia before, the indigenous people of Crete said it was where their people came from. that's the place that their people emerged from this. Now that could be related to a time maybe far as back as human memory could ever come that was post-flood, because these caves are at the top of these mountains.
Yeah.
So humans might have gone into these caves where Noah was, where Mount Ida was, they're the birthplace of their people, and holed out in there for 100 years and fished, and made their living from the ocean, and lived up here in these places and had to develop animal husbandry in order to survive in this way. But I don't know, I'm not a flood historian, but this is a place up there that I really have to go swimming in before I leave this planet. So next slide. So here is, can you tell me where this is?
Yeah, this is a mountain in Manisa, which is maybe a 45-minute car drive from Cephas. We would pronounce the mountain Cephalus, I believe, and it's a magical place for many reasons, as you know.
Right. And so when I look at this image, I just wanted to say that it is not, of course, the humans that lived there would say this is a woman, this is a mother, this is Mother Earth, this is the Magna Mater. She had lots of names, like we suggested before, and you could find tons of names, but I found some more obscure names that I thought I would share today. And one is Agdistis, another is Baracentia, Brimo, Dindamina, and then Kybele, Kaaba, Kababa. And then Rhea, she was called Rhea by the Curates, and we know that she gave birth to Zeus with that name. And the Phrygians called her people the Corbantes. I'm not sure what that word means exactly, but we do know that throughout all these incarnations, the lion and the oak were sacred to her. Another name, a series of names, the Phrygian, the old peoples there, they called her Mata Kybele or Kubelea. And then later, by the Romans, she was called Magna Mater Deorium Idea. Then by the Greeks, or before that, by the Greeks, Meter Theon Idea. And by Proclus, who's a writer later, Mount of Ideas. And we know that her worship, Kybelean worship, went well into the 4th century. Next slide. So here is perhaps how they decided to make individual goddesses that you could have in your home, so that you could have a piece of this mountain in an energy in your own home. And you can see how closely it may even resemble this actual figurine in nature. Next slide. And so next time, I'm going to talk about my pilgrimage where I meet this goddess in the form of Artemis, and have grown to love this goddess so much that I'm now dedicating the College of the Melissa, the works of the College of the Melissa, to her. And next slide. We're going to hear about Andrew's crazy adventures trying to get to this beautiful place. Do you want to mention anything about that? This is
just the fact that I almost died twice. We'll save the details for next episode.
I love that outro. And I came to life with Artemis. I mean, Artemis, it changed my life. It felt like my life had time before I met Artemis and since I met Artemis. So I am indebted forever to this goddess series of who they are and what I'm learning about them and how relevant really it is today. And we're going to get there. We're seriously going to get there. So.
Well, I can't wait. I mean, we've covered so much. And as we always say, we don't really rehearse this. We have a rough idea what we're going to talk about. We each go away and develop our own thing. We don't practice it. So all the tangents and all the sort of tripping and stumbling and going off in this direction, that's all spontaneous. And I think that's really important because it just fosters creativity. And that's what we're trying to achieve.
Right. We want to, what we've discovered. We want to share what we've discovered. And what we've discovered is a profound connection, a deep, multi-layered, multi-storied, intercultural, interhistorical embodiment of an asteroid meets goddess. Now, one thing I want to say is this confusion that we've been having between masculine and feminine is the meeting of the two is what we're talking about, I think, when we talk about the asteroid meeting the Mother Earth and
Fusion. Yeah.
becoming this female. But isn't a pregnant woman both the divine feminine, but also in general, we would know that there was an experience with the masculine, whether it was from a holy way of within themselves or with the masculine. I don't know. We'll get into it.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm looking forward to it. And until then, be well.
All right. You too. Thank you, everybody, for coming. And
thanks, everyone.
Hope to see you again next time.
Next time.
Leader Mouse House.